And they kept, even the women. So if they're women, they're mothers. If they're mothers, there's orphans now. This was an ugly time. Saul wasn't doing some evil things. Then if you read further in Acts 9, you realize that then Saul meets Jesus. The way, the righteous one, the one that he had been persecuting. The one that he was killing people over. Because he was doing God's work after all. Nothing worse than a self-righteous person who's doing something in the name of God that's completely evil and outside of what God would want. So this is Saul. And he gets to meet this famous Jesus. And what happened on that famous day? He was blinded. You know this phrase, knocked off your high horse? I think this is where we get that from. Saul was knocked off his high horse. Literally. Jesus is like, wham! I needed to get your attention. Are you listening now? I'm Jesus, the one you're persecuting. He's like, what, Lord? Yeah, that's right, Lord. And because Saul was so entrenched in the teachings of that religious time, God had to literally blind him so that he could rework even the very way he thought. Because from the time he was a child, he was trained. Think of the same modern day problem. These children that are raised to be suicide bombers, or someone who's raised to be prejudiced, or someone who's raised in a cult. Any of these things. We work so hard to raise our kids up to love the Lord, so people can't shake it off of them when they go off to college or leave. But Saul was trained from an infant up. And so Jesus literally knocked him off his high horse and blinded him. And so now Saul, this mighty, mighty, powerful man, had to be led around. You think God was doing a work in him, maybe? They go, whoa, you're not in charge. So he met Jesus. Now meanwhile, the apostles are still performing miracles. Paul is then led to some places that Jesus had already ordained for him. Worked through some people. And we're not going to read that part. I just want to tell you, now he realized how wrong he was. Guess what he did? He joined right in to the enemy's camp and started preaching about Jesus. The same Jesus he was just killing people for. Wow, how do you do that? If you think about it, think of an example. It would be like Hitler going, hey, let all these people go. Or it would be like, someone in the Middle East joining the infidels. You don't do that. You don't do that. And yet Saul now, because it was such a transformation, couldn't even be called by the same name. Now he was Paul. Some of you need a name change. Because you can't even convince yourself that you are a new creation in Christ. And so God needs to reveal to you who you are. Because you're like, I don't want to be that old person. Well, good. You're not that old person. And many times in the Bible, God changed their name to prove to themselves that he had changed them. And I know God did that for me. Let's pick a good name. But I know that there was a time in my life when God literally said, when I look at you, I don't see Deanna, I see Hannah. And so names are important in our family. And so that's why when Hannah finally had her baby, he was Joshua Samuel. And had her daughter, she was Johanna Grace, the gift of grace. It's important the name you give to your children. And it's no mistake. And then my son, when we finalized his adoption, he chose his own name. He didn't even know what he was doing. God named him Jonathan. And he is Jonathan. It's not what he was born as. But it's amazing. God works through your name. And so this man Saul, who was killing and dragging off women, mothers, orphaning children over this Jesus, met him and went, whoa. So the only difference between our screwed up life and one as powerful as Paul's is that A, we don't even know what name God calls us. We don't see ourselves as God does. And B, we just haven't met Jesus yet. So maybe that's what you're missing this morning. Because that's all it took for him. And so Paul and the disciples now are preaching Jesus. But what would you do if Hitler walked in the midst of World War II and said, hey, how's it going? And came into a Jewish synagogue, which was the very people he was trying to destroy. You wouldn't trust him very much, would you? You're like, get the guards. Put poo at the door. Don't let this guy in. So Paul had some opposition now. It didn't come easy. He had to reestablish who he was. I'm going to reestablish where I am. All right, so they're performing miracles. Okay, so people are talking. I mean, people are, oh my gosh, did you hear that Saul is actually preaching the gospel? He must be playing a trick. He must be setting us up. You know what they do when, this is what they used to do before they could track people down better. If you owed child support or you had some warrants for your arrest, you would get something in the mail that says you've been invited to some free giveaway, and once they get you all in the auditorium, then they arrest everybody. The tricky law enforcement people that they are. And they were convinced this is what Saul was doing. They're like, this guy is infiltrating the Jesus camp so that he can somehow destroy us all. And Paul's like, no, honest, it's me. I'm a new creature. I'm Paul now. I'm not even Saul. God changed my name, and he was telling his story over and over again. His stories are powerful. So by the time we get to Acts 22, now Paul, the one who arrested all these people and was there, is like, yeah, stone that man. He was being arrested for what? For preaching about Jesus. What comes around goes around, I guess. Now the Jewish leaders were mad. And so we get to verse 6, and guess what he did? He told his story. He's like, okay, so, even though back in Acts, it tells the story about how he said, Paul, why do you persecute me? Well, Saul at that time. Well, now we hear the story again, because now Paul's telling his own story. And he's like, but I was on the road to Damascus, and this light shined, and I fell off my horse, and I was blinded, and the Lord said, go to this man, and blah, 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 blah. And he tells them. So Paul is a man with weaknesses now. He's vulnerable. He wasn't vulnerable before. He held all the power. He was known as a very cruel Jewish priest. That's who he was. So the Christians didn't want to trust him. But now he's preaching Jesus, so the Jewish people didn't want to trust him. He's a man without a country, so to speak. You ever feel that way? You're like, man, my old druggy friends don't like me anymore, but I don't really fit in with all these Christian people anymore yet. Fine, I'll just go back. Well, Paul knew he couldn't go back. Because once you've seen the truth sets you free. Because he had a story. You can't deny the story of your life when God touches you. He had imprisoned Christians. He had killed men and women, all in the name of his God. Now, he was also a Roman citizen, which really complicated things because, see, the Jews were living under Roman rule. So he was like living in both. And now he's living in the Christian world. And he's like, who am I? And really, I love Jesus now. And the Jesus people are like, I don't trust you. And the Romans are like, really, you're a Roman? And the Jewish people are going, man, what happened to you? You were one of our leaders. He had no one to turn to now but the Lord.